Welcome back. So, this is lecture 5 of our second module. In the second module, we have looked at a number of cases, number of variables as to how languages can have variations, language varieties can emerge depending on the speaker's contribution. So, how the way the speaker oriented varieties are possible, and we looked at a number of parameters within that, gender and ethnicity, social networks and so on. This is the last lecture, and here we will have a short discussion on the language change. Now, depending on, because we have seen already that language varieties exist because of all of these parameters. So, gender can have an influence, ethnic groups have an influence. So, all of that basically leads to language change, because eventually they create a different and distinct variety. So, thereby we need to look at language change as well. So, this is what we are talking about now. Now, language change is something that is inevitable, that has happened always through history in different time and different space and so on. Here is an example of English language. For example, English spoken, the old English variety that we know is very different from the English spoken now at all levels. So, this is how the written aspect changed, this is how the written part changed. So, then she went to speak this late modern English tongue. You can see how it was written and how it. So, everything changed, the spelling changed, the vocabulary changed, the pronunciation changed, the grammar changed. So, qualitative as well as quantitative changes took place. So, qualitative change includes spelling, vocabulary and grammar. Quantitative changes include frequency of certain words used. So, many changes happen in English language. Similarly, similar kind of changes are visible in other languages in other parts of the world as well. Now, language change is often described as speaker innovation, where speakers of languages innovate often by imitating other languages. We talked about the L1 affecting the L2 and eventually that becoming a distinct part of L2, distinct type of L2. Similarly, when speakers they try to innovate by imitating other languages, that is when you can have changes. So, when their innovation spread in the local communities and are adopted as part of their language, then this results in the change. So, for example, we have seen that Singaporean in Singaporean English, Chinese Singaporeans have a distinct marker, for example, the la they used in the words, or the Maoris used the tag, pragmatic tag a. So, now once that usage of certain terms become widespread in a local community and eventually the spread goes beyond the local community, eventually that becomes a variety on its own. So, the change happens like that. So, it changes, the language change originates from variations. So, when a new form displaces an old form, the linguistic change is accomplished. So, as with sounds, when it replaces another sound over a period of time or when a sound disappears, both can happen. For example, this has been cited by many scholars. For example, the word new and nuclear used to be pronounced as new and nuclear. However, in young people in many parts of the world now are omitting the year, the new, now it sounds more like new. The diphthong is missing in many parts. So, over a period of time, this will become a distinct variety of English spoken by a particular generation. This is primarily found with the younger generation. So, study of language change. So, progress of language change was earlier it was believed to be impossible to observe, because you cannot really see it happening. In fact, Bloomfield I quote, "The process of linguistic change has never been directly observed. Such observation with our present facilities is inconceivable." Lebow's observation suggests that language change represents change in the choices that speakers make over time. Nothing happens, changes in languages specifically takes a long time to really be visible. That is what Lebow's study also found out. There exists a period of variation. This is very important before the change finally arrives. There is a time that is a time window, so to say, where the variations will be visible. And then when change takes place, linguistic change does not occur overnight. So, over a period of time, some groups will use certain markers, other groups will use certain markers, and then those markers have to be accepted in the wider community, and eventually the change will happen. So, language changes or varies in three major interrelated ways: over time, in physical space, and socially. It does not happen in only one domain, it needs to happen in all of these three, sometimes all of these three, sometimes most of these three. So, over time, of course, that is understandable. For any change, it needs time, and physical space, because the domain of influence need to go from the small area compared to over a period of time it will spread over that area. So, a small geographical area to a bigger area, and so on. And of course, socially, because socially there are some very interesting aspects of social change which we will see today. It can move from top to bottom or from bottom to top, both are possible. So, in Manifest of Language Change, William Labov, Weinreich and Marvin Herzog co-authored a seminal paper. This was originally aimed at controversies in historical linguistics, because historical linguistics focuses on language change over time. So, we try to backform, we try to trace the history of various languages going back to the proto form of those languages. So, this was the primary idea of this paper was targeted at that, at the historical context, historical linguistics context, but eventually it became a foundational text in the study of language variation and change. So, they laid out problems or questions that need to be addressed when we talk about language change. They broke down the entire problem into they numbered them. So, different kinds of problems exist when we talk about language change. So, what are those? They have given 5 main types of problems. So, the constraint problem, transition problem, embedding problem, evaluation problem, and finally, actuation problem. These are the 5 problems that makes the gist of language change. So, the constraint problem basically refers to the linguistic context in which change occurs. Basically, this means this goes to what kind of changes that are possible and what in what condition. Not everything changes, right. So, when Indian English came to be, there are certain things that stayed, not everything was tampered with. So, that is the linguistic constraint. What are those linguistic contexts, what are those properties that can change? Transition problem, how did the change move about or get pushed along over generations? So, it has to be for example, in one generation decides to add certain new terminologies, new lexicon, new sound system and so on, but will it get transferred to the next generation? That is also very important, because in order for change to happen, it should not remain just a fluke, just for a brief 5-10 years some people spoke like this, then it will not lead to language change. Language change to be cementified, it needs to transit through generations. So, that is the second problem of how does this transition happen. Embedding problem, what social context or forces drive the change forward. It has to be accepted, right. One fine day one or two people decide to speak in a particular way, need not be allowed to be that way. The social structure has to allow what kind of social, what kind of conducive environment should be there is the question of embedding, because the language has to be ultimately embedded in the social structure. Then comes the evaluation problem, the attitude. In anything that has to do with language, attitude plays a very important role in a society. In fact, there has been very interesting study on the African American vernacular English, even though it is used by a large number of people who are part of the community, and because of which they sometimes didn't do very well in the school, because in the school they use standard English. So, there was a proposal of abolishing the use of African American English, or maybe the proposal was to continue using the Ave variety for quite some time, eventually helping the students to switch to the standard variety. Now, this was opposed by the same community for whose benefit the idea was proposed. So, attitude is very, the reason why they opposed it was they said, the parents of the children said that you are trying to keep us disadvantaged for longer. So, the whole thing was anyway lost. So, this is why attitudes are very important, and then finally actuation, as in finally at what time does the change take place. All of these are background information, the attitude, the linguistic structure, the transition, and then finally the actuation. This is the background. Now, we have the types of change. Of course, this has been studied for a long time, but I have referred to one of the latest studies on this, because of this puts things in perspective in a very simple way. So, change can happen two ways, one can be from above or it can be from below. Now, from Lebow's New York City study, which is of course one of the landmark studies in this domain, the linguistic change that proceeds from higher classes and it is then adopted by the lower classes. So, the one particular group of people in the higher strata of the society, they decide to use language in a particular way, and that percolates down to the lower and lower strata. So, this is above the level of consciousness. The speakers are generally aware of the change and they make overt commentary on the change. It is often associated with the importance of prestige forms, correctness and social mobility. Primarily this means is, what this means is that certain kinds of language change, certain kinds of adaptation of a particular variety is based on our notions of prestige. Prestige typically has to do with the social strata. So, if you speak the variety spoken by the higher class, then you have automatically some of that rubs off on you. Correctness is another factor, and social mobility. So, if you want to be part of that group, then you better speak like them. That these are various reasons of why this kind of change can happen and do happen. And then he goes on to give the examples. So, the loss of the stigmatized diphthong, for example, for 30 was used. This is replaced by the standard from starting with the middle classes. This is what he refers to. Another example is that of Montreal French, the change from alveolar tap r sound to the uvular because of the association of a particular variety with the higher class. That is one. Change from below is also possible. Now, this is counterintuitive. Change from top is understandable, because you are always looking up to the higher class and you are trying to approximate, trying to speak like them, trying to be like them. But change from below, that sounds something does not quite add up, but that also happens. Now, this is a change that originates in the lower social classes and spreads to the higher classes. Now, this is below the level of consciousness. The first one was above the level of consciousness. This is a conscious process whereby we want to sound, we hypercorrect, we want to sound like the upper class, thereby we use language in a particular way, but this happens below the level of consciousness, which means the speakers are not aware of the change and they do not comment on it overtly until it is widespread. Example, T glottal in British English, water becoming So, this ta is omitted and then it is replaced with a glottal stop. This has happened already. So, this is called T glottal. It was associated with the working class varieties of English, the Cockney dialect, which then spread across the UK, now used by higher classes, even so much so that the text mentions that even Princess Diana and Prince Harry uses them. So, this change started at the working class and then eventually spread. That is also possible. Other social factors that lead to language change, these are the primary one, but there are others as well. Role of social network, which we have seen in the previous lecture. So, I will not discuss it at length. So, this a very important study, landmark study in Belfast by Milroy. People who had dense and multiplex social networks had strong local ties and tended to be more conservative of the older or the local forms. So, the tighter the social network, the higher the chances of maintaining certain kinds of language varieties or certain kinds of marker. In this case, it was with the conservative or the conservative form or the old local forms. So, the people who were part of the tight knit system, he divides them the types of social network in terms of density and complexity. So, the people who were both dense and complex, part of both dense and complex network showed this kind of a behavior. People who had looser and more simplex social networks were less likely to retain usage of the local forms. They tend to encourage adoption of innovation. So, you change, this is, you do not need to go all the way to Belfast, it is available, it is visible in any society. So, the older generation or people who are part of that network will be more unwilling to adopt to new changes, and the younger generation who have less complex and less dense connection will be more common, more open to change. That is basically what the finding was, but given the timing, this is all the way back in 1987. So, in this study, strongly networked men deleted the th sound more. So, the sound, the word for mother became like this. So, the sound was missing. Resisting standard forms, while women with looser ties welcomed and used more standard pronunciations. We have seen this before also, when we discussed language and gender, that women tend to be more friendly with the standard forms for various reasons, and that is what we see here also. Now, gender paradox by of Lebov, women tend to be both conservative and innovative. This is something that he popularized, gender paradox, depending on the context. So, conservative women tend to be more conservative in situation where there is an opposition between a standard and a non-standard variation. If that is the situation, then women would prefer the standard variety. Innovative, on the other hand, will happen when a situation of ongoing change, women tend to be at the forefront of the change. That is what Lebov calls a paradox, gender paradox. Thus, there are two types of variation. While all change entails variation, variation does not always entail change. So, variation does not automatically mean change, but typically change will have variation. So, women, depending on the group that they belong to and depending on the situation, they will take either a conservative side or they will be on the innovative side. Now, reasons why language change is gendered, there are many reasons that have been put forward, but few of them I have listed here. Women seem to be more sensitive to socially relevant distinction in behavior than men. So, women serve as the initial founding linguistic influence on children, since they are the primary caregivers and pick up on changes more easily than men do, because they are primary caregivers, they are more sensitive towards these things. For example, Buenos Aires Spanish, women led shift of this sound to the voiceless variant of the sh sound. So, the z to sh sound, while men lagged. So, women were in the forefront of the change that was happening. So, in case of a change, they will lead the change, but when there is a tussle between the conservative and the non-conservative, then in that case they will prefer the standard variety. That is how it is typically seen. Role of ethnicity, again we have discussed this in the previous lecture. So, very briefly, Martha's Vineyard, again we have been repeating, we have been referring to Martha's Vineyard a lot. Here the fishermen and the locals exaggerated vowel raising to mark island identity against the tourists. Martha's Vineyard is a very prominent tourist spot, and there the local fishermen, in order to keep their identity intact, or let us say to create a distinct identity, they made certain changes in the vowel system. So, vowel raising was used in this case. Across the different ethnic groups, there are different rates of uptake of the raising. So, Martha's Vineyard is a small place, but it is very interesting that it has a very complex and diverse set of people. So, depending on the ethnic group, they had different rates of usage of the vowel raising. The Anglos do it to a greater extent than the Portuguese. So, there are different groups and the Indians. So, this is how the difference this map, this graph shows you. So, even within a small geographical region, depending on the social group, and within that there are ethnic groups. So, how that is how complex these things are, depending it depends on various kind. Also attitude played a significant role here. Another example, a little comparatively recent example, here they studied the Canadian vowel shift and ongoing change in the Toronto English. So, two components of the shifting, the lowering and retraction of the air sound, E shifting, it is called E shifting, and the retraction of the air sound, A shifting. The results, Italians led the shift. So, there are these ethnic, different ethnic groups. You have Italians, you have Chinese, and you have the Anglo. So, Italians led the shift, Chinese background speakers resisted the shift, and Anglo speakers had very less participation, they did not even participate. A simple thing, there is a vowel shift happening in the English spoken in Toronto in Canada, but depending on the ethnic group you belong to, your participation in that shift is different. This is what the study showed. Connected term is koine, and the process of creating a koine is called koinization. So, this is another language change process. Now, it is a language change process called koinization when people who speak different dialects come into contact in monolingual communities and a new dialect or variety emerges. This is called a koine. So, this koine adopts features from the contributing dialects, with most of the features coming from the dialect with the largest number of speakers. So, in a monolingual community, different variations are there, different varieties are there, and they decide to create a new dialect, new variety, new dialect that they create. But here the interesting part is that the group which has the largest number of speakers will contribute the largest number of features as well. So, this is how it is created. So, an English town designated as the new town in 1967 had people moved in from different regions, but most came from the east end of the nearby London. As a result, many of the features of the koine developed in this town came from the east end of London region. So, these people, they all are speakers of English, of course British English, but each of these areas speak different varieties of English. The East London variety was taken as the dominant variety, and that is how the language in that particular small region developed. Now, there are different processes within this. For example, one is called leveling and the other is called simplification. Leveling is a process which eliminates marked variance. Leveling results in the koine adopting fewer forms than the range of forms in the source dialect, basically meaning that you are simplifying the whole thing, because if you have, let us say a town has 5 different dialects represented, now you are creating a koine, you are not, it is not, you cannot optimize it by having all those variations. So, you reduce the number of variations, reduce the number of, you adopt fewer forms, range you have to reduce the range. For example, if dialects with post vocalic ra come into contact with dialects that lack it, it leads to the disappearance of the post vocalic ra. Get the point? So, you basically you simplify rather than add more features to the newly formed language, and there that leads us to simplification of the different features or categories. The simpler form will survive wherever different dialects meet. For example, the use of only was is simpler than changing from was to were with different pronouns. So, you level it out. If there are 2-3 types, you stick to one. If there are that is one variety uses ra, another variety does not use ra, then you do not use it at all. Like this, you level it out and simplify. That is the linguistic part of it. The social aspect of it, the social process of it, they also contribute. So, local prestige and relative status, these are very important relevant factors. So, variance only survive if the group of people who use this form belong to an admired and respected group in the community. That is always the case. It is not only about Koine, but it is also about any kind of language, dialect, variation, whatever you talk about. So, this the variations to be created, to sustain, to transit from one generation to another, there has to be the attitude has to be positive. That is what this basically says. There has to be a positive attitude, and that happens only when the group using that variety will have a higher social status. That is basically what it means. And fashion and innovation, communities that value being fashionable or innovative drop conservative forms quickly. That is also another. So, this also has a another color to it. So, depending on time, space, also you will change. The same society may behave differently today as opposed to how they behaved 20 years back. So, this is always, this is a very dynamic kind of a change that happens. So, how do changes spread? Changes spread from group to group. We have talked about wave model. So, we have to take help from the same model again. Remember that we discussed family tree model and wave model. Both are used to understand and study and analyze language change. So, wave model is this, that the new linguistic feature spreads like a wave in different distinct directions. So, a new form appears in a, let us say, in a place, in a town or in a city, and then eventually it spreads to wider areas. So, that is the wave model. Social factors such as age, status, gender and region affect the rates of change, but eventually that is how it goes. So, starting with, so you have stage 1, time 2, time 3, time 4. So, starting in the core area, then it spreads in a ever wider region. That is what it means. From style to style, language change can spread systematically from formal to casual style, from individual to group, from one group to another, and so on. From formal speech to more casual speech, they change from style to style and group to group, till eventually almost everyone uses the new form in their speech style. So, all that this is a very dynamic sort of a model. There are types of speech, there are types of people, there are types of attitude. Eventually, everything falls in place over a period of time. So, that is how the change of style happens. So, prestigious changes always from above and vernacular changes from below. So, we have just seen how changes can happen both ways, from both top to bottom and bottom to top, and then from word to word. So, linguistic change also spread word by word. This is called lexical diffusion. In lexical diffusion, the sound change does not occur all at once. It is very important. Instead, the sound change occurs first in one word and then later in another, and so on. So, eventually over a period of time the change is visible. So, Belfast, the study in Belfast, the vowel in pull changed before put and put before should. So, the vowel change affects only a handful of words, let us say, and then once that change has been fixed, then it will be eventually taken to other words, other similar kind of word. That is what basically this means. East Anglia, the vowel in must changed before come and come before uncle, though all ended up with the same vowel eventually. They do not have the same vowel, right. Normally in English language, the vowel for must and for to come and be and uncle, they all have different vowels, but eventually they all started to sound the same. This is what happened in East Anglia. Similarly, many other places can also have this kind of changes. Now, why do we have change? Of course, some of these things we have already seen, but just to note them down separately as a point. First and foremost, it is status and language change. So, status is very important. Different social groups have introduced different types of change. The spread is often influenced by status, prestige, solidarity and identity. So, higher status introduce change from neighboring communities with greater status and prestige to the whoever you think has higher prestige, like typically the higher social strata or the educated class or standard variety speakers and so on. That is the higher status influencing the language change. On the other hand, you have less conscious linguistic changes, like which is solidarity driven, like we just discussed the example of the working class English that has spread to higher class. It started as a matter of solidarity across the group. For example, the use of man, calling each other man, this also has a very interesting history, you can look up. This is used in a particular community in US, and now it has been used, it has started as a solidarity marker even by the out group, and now it has become quite common not only in US, but also among the wannabes in India. So, this is how the change can happen in both ways. Gender and language change, of course, we have seen it before. Both genders can be innovators in different ways. So, men also can be. So, while men often introduce vernacular changes like the working class changes are typically carried forward by men. So, a study that was done, a small village in Spain, men, mostly dairy farmers, they tied to traditional rural life, and women resisted rural lifestyle and aspired to urban and prestigious roles. Now, women's speech became more Castilian standard, less use of the dialectal U endings and closer to prestige Castilian Spanish. Now, Spain has Castilian and Catalan, two varieties. Castilian is the prestige variety, and so the women here tended to approximate to the Castilian, standard Castilian, prestige Castilian Spanish variety. That is one interesting case study. Interaction and language change, of course, interaction has a lot of role to play. This is visible today more than any time in history. Earlier changes happened when people came into contact, people moved, social mobility and people moving for education, business, for work, for whatever, but different kinds of reasons, and that brought in changes. But today you do not have to travel. You have media, you have social networks, you have all kinds of other things that brings you in contact with other groups, out groups, and so change is far more rapid today than it ever was. So, this has been also studied a lot, media introducing to us to new forms, and eventually people also start talking like that. A case in point would be just notice how the news reading has changed over a period of time. Now, the way news reading happens in most of the news channels has a very distinct style, and you will see that style has also percolated to the to some people who they speak like that. Similarly, you have a particular variety of speaking in among the young adults in US. It has been called by many names, we will not be using the names here, but there is a particular variety, a kind of a slurred kind of a variety that is used by young generation typically. That is also something that you will see in some cities in India already. So, this is how interaction with the world, with our other groups can bring in changes. One interesting study in Kupwar, the study was carried out on this particular area, which has 3,000 inhabitants. There are 3 distinct groups in this particular place, where there are Jains, there are Marathis. So, Jains use Kannada, the Muslims use Urdu, and the untouchables speak Marathi in this particular place. Now, daily life involves constant switching among languages, as a result of which, now this is a place, there are 3 distinct groups, each of them using a different language for their own identity or whatever. Now, because of the constant long term connection, languages are becoming similar. In linguistics, we call this convergence. So, as a result of which, identical word order, similarities in inflections and structures, we have an example here. Word for word translation is now possible. However, distinct identities are still preserved through divergence in vocabulary, because you cannot India is called a linguistic area, because for millennia multiple languages have been living side by side. This has resulted in many languages sharing property of other languages over a period of time. That is what resulted in the Sprachbund. But at the same, this is the convergence, where for example, the retroflex sound is now visible in many languages of the country. We do not know which part it came from, that of course, is a matter of debates and so on, but this is shared. Similarly, many other reduplication is another factor. So, similar a smaller more mini version of that entire thing can be visible here. So, languages when they are in touch, constant touch, they tend to converge, but at the same time if the social attitude permits, there will also be effort at keeping the diversity intact, and often we people do it, many communities do it. There are interesting ethnographic studies on that. Maybe we will further down the course we will discuss some of them. Sometimes that is by creating new lexical items, the divergence is maintained, the distinct identity is maintained. So, divergence in vocabulary in this case has helped in keeping the identities preserved. So, on the one hand there is a convergence in language terms, but on the other hand the identity, social identity needs to be maintained, and that has been achieved by using different lexical terms. So, this is where we come to the end of lecture 5, and with this we complete the module as well. So, this is the end of module 2. Thank you.